The forgotten orphanage stands like a scar carved into the hillside, its walls fractured but unbroken, its windows dark and hollow as empty eyes. Once this building echoed with laughter, 68 voices bouncing down its corridors like sunlight trapped in stone. But one night, without warning, without reason, all of those voices disappeared. Not a single cry was heard, not a single trace left behind. When the townspeople climbed the hill at dawn, they found lanterns still burning, meals still steaming on long tables, and beds still warm, as if the children had only just risen. Yet every child was gone. Imagine the silence that greeted them. Shoes neatly placed by doors, marbles scattered mid-game across wooden floors, dolls leaning against pillows with unblinking glass eyes, as if they alone had witnessed what had unfolded. A chalkboard half filled with lessons frozen in time, waiting for hands that would never return. That silence was heavier than screams. Parents screamed their children's names into the fog, their voices cracking, but only echoes returned. Priests hurried to the gates with holy water, but their prayers dissolved before touching the stone. Search parties scoured the valley, combed the forests and dragged the riverbanks, but not a single footprint, scrap of cloth or whisper of life was uncovered. 68 children could not simply vanish, yet they had. Fear settled into the town like rot. Whispers spread, wolves, famine, plague, kidnappers, even demons. But none of these explained the untouched food, the absence of struggle, the locked doors with no signs of forced entry. Some muttered of cults, of rituals, of something dark buried beneath the orphanage's foundations waiting to be fed. Yet no blood, no carvings, no evidence was ever found. Still, the explanations died on trembling lips, leaving only terror. The hill became forbidden ground. The townspeople avoided the gates after dusk, as though the silence itself might reach down and consume them too. Children who dared each other to climb the hill swore they heard whispers, giggles, tiny footsteps skittering behind the walls. Travelers reported swings creaking in the courtyard, though the wind lay still, or pale faces staring from the highest windows before vanishing into dark. Decades later, men of science came with instruments and notebooks determined to explain away superstition, but their equipment faltered. Compass needles spun wildly, batteries drained, recordings caught only static layered with faint murmurs like distant crying. Priests returned with crosses and hymns, but their chants seemed to sink into the stone, swallowed whole, leaving only silence thicker than before. Official records declared the building condemned, too unsafe for living souls, yet no hand dared to demolish it. Perhaps they feared destroying the walls might release whatever had taken those children. Perhaps the silence had already claimed the ground itself. The tragedy was not just disappearance, it was erasure. Names faded from church books, blurred ink that no longer made sense. Graves were never dug, funerals never held. The children became less than memory, reduced to whispers of their vanishing, shadows of their absence. Today, the orphanage waits. Its silence is not empty but alive, pressing against the skin, humming low like a held breath. Step inside and the air wraps tight around you, suffocating, as though unseen eyes watch from every corner. Some say if you listen long enough you can hear laughter under the silence, laughter trapped in stone, belonging to children who should have turned to dust long ago. This is not only the tale of missing children, it is a wound carved into history, a night that never ended, an echo that refuses to die. Welcome to the forgotten orphanage, where innocence was swallowed whole and silence became the loudest sound of all. The year was 1892, a time when superstition and faith still clashed with the first sparks of science, and small towns lived under the shadow of isolation. The orphanage had been built on the crest of a hill outside the valley settlement, a stone structure raised by charitable hands but whispered about even before its walls were complete. The land chosen for it was not ordinary land. Locals told of ancient burial grounds, of pagan shrines buried deep beneath the soil, of a fire that had once swept the hill and left the earth blackened for decades. But the church dismissed such fears, declaring the hill a place of hope where abandoned children would find shelter. The building rose quickly, gray stone blocks, iron gates, high-arched windows meant to let in light. Inside, wooden floors stretched across dormitories, classrooms, and a chapel at the center. To outsiders it looked noble, but to villagers it loomed like a fortress watching them from above. At night its windows glowed like eyes. The orphanage soon filled with children left by famine, sickness, and war. 68 in total on the last night, boys and girls ranging from toddlers barely able to walk to teenagers on the cusp of adulthood. They came from broken homes, nameless graves, burned farms, from every corner of suffering. Their laughter should have been salvation, yet it clashed against the gloom of the stone halls. Caretakers spoke often of how the air inside always felt heavy, how the walls seemed to drink in sound rather than carry it. The headmistress, a stern widow named Eleanor Whitlock, ruled the orphanage with strict devotion. She kept meticulous records, lines of names inked into her ledgers, notes on health, discipline, and behavior. She was known to wander the chapel at night, whispering prayers longer than her candle should have burned. Her staff included 3 women: Mary Collins, the cook whose meals filled the corridors with warmth; Sister Agnes, a quiet nun with a gaze that unsettled even adults; and Clara Finch, a young teacher with trembling hands who wrote lessons in chalk that sometimes broke under pressure. These women cared for the children, though none could erase the shadows that clung to the place. The townspeople never trusted the orphanage. They claimed voices carried down the hill at odd hours, not cries or laughter, but whispers too low to be human. Farmers crossing the valley at dawn saw shapes in the windows long before the children were awake. Hunters spoke of animals avoiding the woods surrounding the building, deer turning from paths that led near, dogs howling when forced too close. Yet poverty forced the community to depend on the orphanage. Families could not afford to raise extra mouths, so infants were delivered at its gates, left with a prayer and a blanket. Some parents never returned, some visited rarely, but all lived with unease, as though giving their children to the hill meant bargaining with something unseen. Records from the town council describe attempts to integrate the orphanage into the life of the valley: holiday feasts, church gatherings, harvest blessings. But each time something disturbed the efforts. During one Christmas service, candles in the chapel guttered all at once, though the night was still. At a harvest feast, several children fell violently ill without cause, though no sickness spread after. These incidents etched fear into the hearts of the villagers. They began to whisper that the building was cursed, that no celebration could soften its hunger. Yet life continued. Children played in the courtyard, swinging on iron frames, rolling hoops, chasing each other across cracked stones. From a distance they seemed normal, faces flushed with youth, shouts carrying on the wind. But caretakers reported oddities: children waking with scratches they could not explain, drawings appearing on classroom walls though no chalk was near, murmured conversations in empty dormitories after lights were extinguished. Still, the orphanage functioned, day after day, until the night when all 68 vanished. Before that night, rumors had intensified. Villagers swore they saw candles burning in upper windows long after the children slept. Some claimed to hear singing carried on the wind, hymns not of the church but something older, stranger, in a language they could not place. Sister Agnes was said to have grown restless, wandering alone with rosaries clenched so tight her fingers bled. Clara Finch wrote in her diary of shadows moving against the walls when no one walked there. Even Eleanor Whitlock confided to the priest that she felt the building resisted her, as if she were a guest in her own domain. These warnings were ignored or dismissed as imagination, the product of fear. Yet they lingered, waiting like a storm at the horizon. And so the stage was set: a hill with a cursed history, a building raised against the will of the land, a collection of children marked by loss, and caretakers burdened by secrets they could not speak. The valley watched the orphanage with wary eyes, sensing a darkness it could not name. When the night came that stole 68 lives, it did not erupt from nowhere. It had been building, breath by breath, shadow by shadow, waiting for its moment to consume. In the weeks leading to the disappearance, the orphanage seemed to breathe differently. The children grew restless, their laughter carrying an uneasy edge, their games shorter, their nights longer. Caretakers reported sleeplessness spreading like a fever. Little ones woke screaming but could not describe what they had seen. Older boys whispered of figures at the foot of their beds, shapes that vanished when candles were lit. Clara Finch, the teacher, wrote in her journal that lessons had become impossible. When she stood before the chalkboard, her words faltered, distracted by murmurs she swore came from the walls. Once she turned to find letters scrawled in chalk that she had not written, crooked, jagged, forming no recognizable word. She erased them quickly, though her hand trembled. Sister Agnes grew thin and pale. She muttered prayers in corners, refusing food, claiming she could hear children chanting when none were near. One night she locked herself in the chapel, and the sound of her rosary beads striking wood echoed through the halls until dawn. Mary Collins, the cook, confided to Eleanor Whitlock that pots shifted on their own, spoons clattered in empty kitchens, and sometimes the smell of smoke filled the air, though no fire burned. Whitlock dismissed these accounts with stern authority, insisting the staff must stay strong. Yet even she was seen pacing at night, lantern in hand, her eyes darting to the ceilings as if listening for something moving above. The children's behavior changed more drastically. They began drawing strange patterns on slates, circles intersected with jagged lines, repeated endlessly as if compelled. Younger ones stared at doorways, giggling at nothing visible. A group of girls refused to sleep in their dormitory, claiming they heard scratching beneath the floorboards. Older boys grew violent, erupting into sudden fights without cause, their faces blank after the blows. The townsfolk noticed too. Farmers crossing the valley swore they heard singing from the hill long after the building had gone dark, a low melody that chilled the blood. Hunters reported the woods surrounding the orphanage had fallen silent. No bird sang there, no deer wandered near. Dogs whimpered and pulled away when led toward the gates. Rumors spread fast. The orphanage was marked, the land beneath it alive with hunger. The priest was summoned again. He arrived with holy water, sprinkling each doorway, murmuring Latin verses. For a brief moment the staff felt relief, but that very night children began screaming in unison, all 68 voices crying out, "Don't let him in!" When the staff rushed to the dormitories, the children were awake, eyes wide, pointing toward the windows. Outside the fog lay heavy, but no intruder stood beyond the glass. Days later the whispers began. Children told of a man they saw in their dreams, standing at the gates with arms outstretched. Some claimed he called their names, promising warmth, food, freedom. Others said he had no face, only darkness where features should be. Eleanor Whitlock dismissed these accounts as nightmares, but Clara Finch's journal told another story. She wrote that she too had seen him, not in sleep, but reflected in the chapel glass one evening as she extinguished candles, a tall shadow unmoving, head tilted as though studying her. The townspeople became desperate. Parents demanded their children be brought down from the hill, but Whitlock refused, insisting her charges were safe within the orphanage walls. She told them fear was infecting the community, that superstition must not dictate care. Yet fear spread faster than truth. Whispers became warnings, warnings became prophecy. Some swore the land beneath the orphanage was cursed ground, soaked in blood from forgotten wars. Others claimed the building itself was alive, built with stones that remembered screams. Still others whispered of a cult hidden within the town, feeding children to unseen gods in exchange for prosperity. Each tale twisted darker than the last, and each tale pointed to the same conclusion. Something was about to happen. The final week was drenched in omens. Crows circled the hill in numbers never seen before, their cries endless and harsh. Candles refused to stay lit, their flames sputtering into smoke. Children were found sleepwalking through the halls, their eyes open but vacant, their feet carrying them toward the chapel. On the last night, the fog rolled down thick from the hills, swallowing the valley whole. Villagers claimed they heard faint singing drifting on the wind, a chorus of children's voices joined by one deeper tone. In the orphanage, supper was prepared but uneaten. Beds were laid but not slept in. The staff tried to keep order, but the children were restless, whispering, giggling, crying, as though waiting for something they could not name. The stage was set, every shadow sharpened, every whisper thick with promise. By dawn, the orphanage would stand silent, stripped of all life. The 68 would be gone. The hill would become cursed forever. The buildup was not a collection of random events. It was a march, a slow and steady procession into the mouth of something that had always been waiting. The night of the vanishing began with fog, a thick and rolling sea of white that swallowed the orphanage hill until the building seemed to float above the earth like a ship adrift. Lanterns along the path sputtered, their flames shrinking to pale embers before snuffing out. Inside, the air was dense, pressing on lungs as if the house itself wanted to choke the breath from those within. Mary Collins tried to keep the children calm with warm bread, pulled hastily from the oven, but even food could not settle them. They sat silent, eyes wide, glancing toward doors and windows as though listening for something only they could hear. Clara Finch wrote later in her final surviving note that the silence was worse than screams. The children seemed to anticipate something inevitable. They whispered in unison, fragments of words she did not understand, as if repeating a lesson no one had taught them. Sister Agnes paced the chapel, her rosary clutched so tight blood seeped from her palms. She insisted shadows were gathering not outside, but within the walls themselves. Eleanor Whitlock attempted authority, but her commands faltered as the building moaned. Floorboards creaked though no one walked. Windows rattled though no wind stirred. Then the knocking began. Soft at first, 3 steady raps upon the great iron door. Every child froze. Some began crying, others clutched hands, whispering, "Don't let him in." Whitlock, pale but unyielding, strode forward and flung the door wide, expecting to face pranksters or parents. Nothing waited beyond, only the fog, thick and endless, curling like smoke into the threshold. Yet the moment the door opened, the air shifted. A coldness swept through the halls, extinguishing candles in an instant. The children screamed as darkness swallowed them. In the pitch black, voices rose. Not the voices of the living, but something lower, ancient, layered like 100 tones at once. Words not spoken but felt in bone and marrow, commanding, calling. The children answered. 68 voices lifted in unison, chanting in that same foreign tongue Clara had scrawled in her diary. Their cries were not of fear but obedience. Staff rushed to gather them, but hands passed through air where bodies should have been. Some children stood, eyes rolled white, walking in straight lines toward the chapel as though pulled by invisible strings. Others climbed from their beds, their steps in perfect rhythm, as if rehearsed for a ritual they should not have known. The chapel doors swung open without touch. Inside, candles blazed to life, though no flame was set. The great wooden cross above the altar cracked down the middle with a sound like thunder, its pieces falling but never striking the ground. They hung suspended in the air, trembling as though held by unseen hands. Sister Agnes screamed prayers, her voice breaking, yet the sound was devoured, muffled as if the stone itself swallowed her words. Clara Finch tried to gather the smallest children, clutching them to her chest, but they slipped free, their tiny hands cold as ice. They marched past her, faces blank, toward the altar. Mary Collins attempted to drag one back, but the child dissolved in her arms like smoke. She shrieked as her hands closed on nothing but mist. The chanting grew louder, filling the chapel until the very glass of the windows shivered. Eleanor Whitlock stood in the doorway, her lantern raised high, but even her iron will faltered. She shouted for silence, for discipline, but her voice was drowned in the ocean of sound. Then the fog poured through the broken windows, spilling into the chapel like a tide. It crawled across the floor, wrapped around ankles, climbed to knees, to waists. The children did not resist. They let the fog swallow them, their outlines blurring, their bodies fading as though the mist was devouring flesh. Clara's journal entry broke here. Her ink streaked, the final words scrawled, "They are going home." By dawn, the orphanage was still. The fog had retreated, leaving silence heavier than stone. Lanterns hung cold. Bread lay uneaten. Beds were empty but still warm, as though 68 children had only just risen moments before. But no child remained. No caretaker survived. The chapel was empty, its cross split in two upon the floor. Only Whitlock's ledger remained, pages torn, the last line smeared but visible. All present, all taken. When dawn broke over the valley, the orphanage stood silent against the pale sky. The fog lifted slowly, revealing a building that seemed untouched, as if the night had been nothing more than a fevered dream. Yet when the villagers climbed the hill, their hearts sank into dread. The great iron door stood ajar. Inside, the air hung heavy, damp, carrying no warmth of life. The first rooms told the story. Plates still rested on the dining tables, bread torn but uneaten, cups half filled with milk that had soured in the night. Small shoes sat neatly lined by the doors, each pair waiting for feet that would never return. Dolls rested in corners, marbles rolled beneath chairs, slates lay covered in chalk drawings left unfinished. The rooms were not ransacked. They were abandoned. Beds remained unmade but warm to the touch, as though children had risen moments before the intruders entered. The silence was unbearable. Parents cried out names, their voices cracking, echoing through halls that gave nothing back. Mothers clutched toys left behind. Fathers tore through wardrobes searching for scraps of cloth. Any sign of a struggle, any proof that their children had not simply dissolved into the air. Yet nothing. No blood, no footprints, no broken glass, not even a single open window explained their absence. The staff were gone as well. Eleanor Whitlock's office sat in order, her ledger open on the desk. Every line of names stood recorded in perfect hand until the last, where her ink trailed off into jagged strokes. Sister Agnes's rosary lay snapped upon the chapel floor, beads scattered like black tears across stone. Clara Finch's diary was discovered half hidden beneath a pew, the final page smudged, blurred by what seemed to be tears. The words, "They are going home," carved deeper than the rest. Mary Collins left only her apron, dropped near the stove where bread had burned to ash. Search parties spread at once. The villagers combed the valley, the riverbanks, the forests. They called for dogs, but the animals whimpered and refused to climb the hill. Men dragged nets through the water, cut through undergrowth, dug in shallow earth, but not a single footprint, scrap of fabric or bone was uncovered. It was as if 68 children and their keepers had been plucked from the world without leaving a shadow behind. Panic gripped the town. Mothers collapsed in grief. Fathers struck out at one another. Priests filled the air with prayers and bells. Rumors bloomed faster than truth. Some whispered the children had been taken by wolves, though no tracks scarred the soil. Others muttered of gypsies or bandits, but no caravan had passed near in months. The darker tales spoke louder, that the hill had claimed its due, that the orphanage was cursed ground demanding sacrifice. Fear turned inward. Families who had left children at the gates were shunned, accused of feeding innocents to the hill. The church became a place of wailing, the chapel filled with grieving mothers clutching blankets and shoes. Bells tolled endlessly, yet their sound offered no comfort. Days stretched into weeks. The authorities sent men from the city to investigate. They scoured the orphanage, marking every stone, sketching every room, recording every item. They found no sign of forced entry, no tunnels, no hidden doors. The building was sound, locked from within. Records confirmed 68 children had been present the night before. But of their fates, not a clue. The investigators left with empty hands, their official reports vague, speaking of unexplained circumstances and no evidence of abduction. To the townspeople, this was no relief. It was proof the world of law and order had no answer. Fear became ritual. Villagers avoided the hill entirely. They crossed themselves when passing its shadow. Farmers refused to plow the fields nearest its base. At night, the glow of lanterns in its windows still appeared, though no soul lived within. Some swore they heard children's voices drifting down the slope, laughter carried on the wind. Others claimed to see pale faces pressed against the glass, hands beating softly as though trapped within. Time turned grief into legend. Graves were never dug, funerals never held. The names of the missing faded from memory, replaced only by the number 68. The orphanage was condemned, left to rot, but no hand dared strike it down. The building became a monument to terror, its silence heavier with each passing year. Generations later, the story persisted. Travelers warned not to climb the hill, not to enter the building where silence hummed like a living thing. Children dared each other to touch its gates, returning pale and shaken, swearing they felt small hands clutch their own before vanishing. Even now, the valley carries the weight of that night. Parents tell their young to stay away, to listen for voices in the fog. The loss became not only personal, but cultural, etched into the bones of the community. The orphanage was no longer a place. It was a wound, an emptiness where laughter should have been, a hollow carved out of history that no prayer, no law, no reason could fill. The longer the valley lived beneath the shadow of the orphanage, the heavier the mystery grew. Rational minds tried to untangle it, yet every attempt collapsed beneath the same impossible silence. Historians combed through parish records, finding nothing but the confirmation of the children's existence, their baptisms, their placement in the home. Clerks traced bloodlines, hoping some relative might have reclaimed them in secret, but no family claimed reunion. The names simply ended, written in ink and never again appearing in church or census. Skeptics swore that there had to be an explanation buried in human hands. Perhaps the staff had spirited the children away under cover of fog, sold them to factories or worse. Yet even that grim speculation could not explain the utter absence of trails, wagons, or buyers. No whispers in cities, no sightings in towns. It was as though the valley itself had closed around them and swallowed the truth whole. The diaries and objects left behind became artifacts of obsession. Clara Finch's cryptic words, "They are going home," were studied like scripture. Scholars argued endlessly. Did she mean heaven, death, or some darker notion of belonging to the hill? Eleanor Whitlock's broken line of ink was examined under magnifying glasses, each scratch interpreted as fear, as resistance, as surrender. Some believed she had seen something in that final moment, something that drove the pen from her grasp. Sister Agnes's shattered rosary became a relic. Pilgrims came to see it, some kneeling before the scattered beads as though holiness clung to them, others recoiling as if they carried a curse. Mary Collins's abandoned apron haunted housewives, who whispered that she had dropped it while fleeing something unseen. Every object spoke, but none gave answers. Theories multiplied like weeds. Priests insisted it was divine punishment, proof of the community's sin, a demand for repentance. They urged fasting, processions, and vigils, but the children did not return. The superstitious claimed the hill was a thin place, where the veil between worlds frayed and gave way. They pointed to the fog, how it rolled thicker there than anywhere else, how lanterns glowed strangely in its embrace. They told stories of the old pagan stones buried beneath the orphanage foundations, remnants of rituals long forgotten. Some whispered of bargains struck centuries earlier, debts paid not in coin but in blood. The rationalists countered with darker human theories. Perhaps Whitlock herself had gone mad, leading children to their deaths. Perhaps the staff had poisoned them, buried them deep in the earth. But if so, where were the graves? Excavations yielded nothing but untouched soil. No disturbed ground, no hidden cellars, no trace of mass burial. The mystery resisted all efforts to reduce it to crime or madness. As decades passed, the case drew travelers, journalists, and investigators from distant cities. Each arrived with confidence and left hollow-eyed, muttering of inexplicable silences, of cold drafts that bent candles indoors, of children's laughter echoing in empty halls. One journalist, after spending a night in the chapel, swore he woke to find dozens of small handprints pressed into the frost on the window glass. He fled at dawn and never wrote again. Another visitor, a skeptic determined to debunk the legend, vanished after climbing the hill alone. His notebook was later found at the gates, filled with frantic sketches of faces half-formed in fog. Legends clung to the place like ivy. The children were said to march on misty nights, their outlines glimpsed through trees, hands clasped in silent procession. Sometimes a lantern flickered among them, guiding their steps. Some swore that if one followed, the march would lead into fog that never lifted, and the follower would vanish too. Fishermen spoke of voices rising from the river, as if the children sang from beneath its surface. Shepherds claimed their flocks refused to graze near the hill, panicked by things unseen. The town grew around the absence, each generation weaving its own explanation. For some, it became cautionary lore. Children were warned to obey, lest the hill take them too. For others, it became sacred, a reminder of the fragility of life. Candles were lit every anniversary, their flames trembling in the valley wind. The church tolled its bells 68 times, once for each child, though no funerals had ever been sung. The sound carried up the slope and seemed to die within the orphanage walls, as though absorbed by the silence. Not all accepted the mystery quietly, some men obsessed to the point of ruin. Farmers abandoned their fields to search the hill, carving symbols into trees, convinced they could draw the children back. A school teacher lost her post after insisting the missing children whispered answers to her lessons at night. She spent her days sitting before the orphanage gates, waiting for faces that never appeared. The town began to fear not only the hill, but the madness it inspired. The greatest terror lay not in what was seen, but in what remained unseen. No monster ever revealed itself, no crime confessed, no grave unearthed. The mystery was not violent, it was empty. It offered no closure, no witness, no proof. It was absence given shape, a wound that could not heal because it never bled. To live near the orphanage was to live with that hollow truth. That children had laughed one evening and then ceased to exist. That their toys, shoes, and beds waited still, preserved not by memory but by silence. With time, the orphanage itself decayed. Roof beams sagged, windows shattered, ivy clawed across its stones. Yet even in ruin it did not lose its grip. Travelers who entered described the same chill, the same unnatural hush, the same sense that unseen eyes tracked their every step. The silence was not merely absence of sound, it was presence, thick and heavy, pressing into the bones. Some swore the building breathed, others said it remembered. Mystery became its own religion. People no longer sought answers, they sought communion with the unknown. They carried offerings to the gates, dolls, ribbons, candles, prayers. Some begged for lost children to return, others asked the hill to spare their own. No answer came. Only the fog moved, curling around gifts before swallowing them. And still, every so often someone claimed to glimpse small figures among the mist, waiting, watching, never speaking. Thus the orphanage passed into legend not as a place of crime nor miracle, but as mystery itself. Unyielding, unresolved, eternal. It defied reason, defied faith, defied grief. It remained the question no one could answer, the silence no one could break, the shadow no one could escape. For in the end, the true terror was not what happened on that night. It was that no one would ever know. As years stretched into decades, the valley carried its wound like a scar that refused to fade. The orphanage decayed stone by stone, yet no storm, no hand of man could fully erase it. Walls leaned but did not fall. Windows shattered but still framed the fog. It was as if the building itself resisted death, clinging to the world the way the memory of those children clung to the living. The townspeople grew old beneath its shadow. Some never spoke of it, refusing to pass the terror on to their children. Others could not help but whisper the tale at firesides, their voices trembling as if the fog might creep through their words. Every retelling carried a weight, a reminder that silence itself could be the cruelest captor. When strangers came to the valley, they felt it at once. The quiet was heavier here, the air colder, the hill darker even beneath summer sun. Guides would point to the orphanage, daring travelers to step inside. Some returned pale and wordless, their lips refusing to share what they had felt. Others never returned at all. The hill claimed new victims, not through violence but through vanishing. the same way it had claimed the children. This cycle turned the orphanage from tragedy into legend, its story retold across lands, each version darker than the last. Some called it cursed ground, others called it holy, yet no one called it safe. The greatest cruelty of all was the absence of graves. Parents grew old without ever laying flowers. Siblings carried the weight of missing brothers and sisters into their own graves. The lack of closure hollowed them, like echoes that never reached an end. The town marked anniversaries with bells and candles, but the ceremonies felt like lies, for no one knew what they mourned. Were the children dead, wandering another realm, or hidden by some horror too great to name? The uncertainty gnawed deeper than grief. Grief ends, uncertainty never does. Stories spread far beyond the valley. Writers penned accounts embellishing the fog into a living creature, the orphanage into a mouth that devoured the innocent. Preachers thundered of divine wrath, warning congregations that sin drew down judgment like fog upon a hill. Scientists came with measuring instruments, testing air and soil, charting magnetic anomalies. They left baffled, their tools intact but their certainty fractured. One declared the orphanage a tear in the fabric of reason. His colleagues laughed, but his eyes never lost their haunted glaze. As the 20th century dawned, the world modernized, yet the orphanage remained. Electric lights flickered in the valley, cars rumbled along its roads, yet on the hill, gas lamps still seemed more fitting. Modern minds tried to laugh at old fears, yet even skeptics walked faster when passing the orphanage at night. No matter how high the age rose in science and progress, the shadow of those 68 vanished children still dragged the world backward, into awe, into dread. Some dreamed of reclaiming the building, turning it into a school again or a memorial, but every attempt faltered. Workmen refused to stay after sundown, claiming tools vanished, ladders shook, whispers curled through empty rooms. One swore he saw children's faces reflected in shattered glass, staring back with hollow eyes. He fled, never to return. No builder would take the contract again. The orphanage remained untouched, an open wound no one dared stitch closed. Even as the valley emptied with time, its farms failing, its young fleeing to cities, the orphanage stood. Ivy smothered its walls, bats roosted in its rafters, yet still the fog gathered thickest there as though guarding what lay within. Travelers who passed through carried tales to distant lands, and so the children lived on, not in flesh, not in spirit, but in story. They became eternal not through survival, but through disappearance. And so the tragedy settled into history's darkest shelf. It was not a tale of villains punished, nor of heroes remembered. It was not even a tale of death, for death at least leaves bodies. It was a tale of vanishing, of silence, of loss without end. That was its horror. Not the sight of blood, but the void where life should have been. No one could prove it. No one could solve it, no one could bury it. The orphanage endured because its silence endured. At last, only legend remained. They say on certain nights when the fog curls thickest, the hill comes alive. Small footprints appear in dew. Windows glow though no lamp burns inside. A faint chorus of laughter drifts across the valley, carried by the wind, fading before it reaches the ear. Some claim the children march still, unseen yet near, waiting for someone to notice, someone to follow. Others believe they are gone forever, leaving only echoes, shadows, fragments of sound in the mist. But all agree on one thing: the silence of the orphanage is never empty. Thus ends the tale of the forgotten orphanage, where 68 children vanished overnight. Its walls remain, its silence deepens, its shadow lengthens across history. It stands not as ruin but as warning, that some wounds never close, some questions never yield, some losses never rest. And perhaps that is the truest horror, that in the end, the children's absence became their eternity. A haunting that no prayer, no science, no time could erase.